As promised, this is the second video for week number 3 of our course. In this particular video, we're going to be covering the chapter number 7, okay, which is the chapter on learning. And specifically, we're going to be discussing the issues of memory, encoding, storage, and retrieval, all the parts of psychology that deal with the concept of learning. So hopefully you've had a chance to read chapter 7 by now. And again, the purpose of this video is to highlight the key words and concepts in chapter 7 that I want you to take away from your reading. So let's go ahead and get started. Memory is the sum total of what we remember and gives us the capability to learn and adapt from previous experiences, as well as you know, of course, to build relationships. It is the ability to remember past experiences and the power or process of recalling to mind learned facts, experiences, impressions, skills, and habits that makes us human. It is the store of things learned and retained from our activities and experiences, or by recall and recognition. So you have a definition from the book here of memory, the persistence of learning over time. We're going to talk about each of the components of encoding, storage, and retrieval of information. As we get started, I want you to think about a concept that we discussed in the previous chapters called behaviorism. Remember that? Operant and classical conditioning? Well, the concept of memory in particular, and particularly information processing, takes us from a behavioral model to what's called a cognitive model. Cognitive, the brain, thinking. And so we're going to talk about this concept of information processing, which is a cognitive model of looking at memory as similar to a computer. Input, processing, and output. So we'll take a look at all of those. Let's get some definitions that you should have picked up from your reading. Make sure you underline those and score those for our course. The first is encoding, and it's also called input if you're looking at, again, that information processing or computer model. And it's how information gets into our brains in the way that we allow it to be stored. So pick that up as a key concept for chapter 7. Storage, of course, is how information is held in a way that we can retrieve it over time. We can bring it back into our consciousness. And the concept of retrieval is pretty much getting information out of our memory, recalling or reactivating the information, and that has a lot to do, as you'll see, in terms of how it was encoded in the first place. Two other concepts that I want you to pull from chapter 7 is the concept of sensory memory. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but it is the initial recording of information as it comes into memory from our 5 senses. We talked a little bit about this with behaviorism and with conditioning. And then the other concept I want you to get is that of working memory. Again, how once we get it in, how do we begin to process it? Two other concepts of memory for you to remember is short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory is the way we take in information and we hold it for only just a few seconds, and then we got to do something with it. So we either have to figure out a way to act on it, or we have to figure out a way to store it. And we store it, of course, into more permanent memory called long-term memory. And the psychologists are very, the interesting part of psychology is how we deal with these two kinds of memories, how we can help learn. And for anybody that might be interested in becoming a teacher, this is critical, because we as teachers want to figure out how we can help our students, our learners, take information that we're giving them from short-term memory and make it more permanent. All right, there's a simplified memory model here. I'm not going to spend much time on this. came from your reading. But this is basically the information processing model. It's used as a framework, again, by cognitive psychologists to explain and describe the processes that go on in memory. And we liken it to how a computer works. So you can see here you have sensory input coming in at the front end of the model. This word encoding is here. Short-term memory is there. And then short-term memory, using the concept of encoding, will take the information and move it into long-term memory. And then the concept of retrieval will take it from long-term memory and bring it back into working memory. So kind of reread that section of the chapter if you need to, but this just kind of gives you an interesting model of how memory happens. We'll expand on this a little more right now. Let's talk with the first piece, encoding. Remember, what was the other word for encoding with the information processing model? Yeah, it was the word input. Okay, so this is the input side. And as you can see from the little graphic, there's three basic ways in which we recognize information coming into our consciousness and we begin to act on it or encode it. The first is semantic encoding. When I talk to you using words, you're using your semantic encoding. If I were to use words that you didn't understand, you could see how, or speak to you perhaps maybe in a different language, you could see how semantic encoding would be very difficult to produce any meaningful information. Acoustic encoding and visual encoding gives you encoding by sounds and pictures. And so we take information in all three ways here. I could just as easily have done this presentation just as an audio presentation. No video, no other sound. Or I could have even given it to you like we did, assigning you a chapter. So you can see when I give you a chapter to read, I'm asking you to do semantic encoding. If I were to do an audio-only presentation, it would be acoustic encoding. But I try to use all three of them. I have you read the chapter, and then I give you a PowerPoint presentation like this, which brings the two together of sound and images. So think about this for a second. The more ways you can encode information, the better chances are that you're going to learn it, that you're going to remember it. Now, even so, with all the things coming into our consciousness, all the inputs that are coming in, everybody understands that you can only remember so many things. There's only so much that you can do. And so the psychologists talk about tools, like this first one, and we'll talk about two or three of them here. Mnemonics is the first one. It's a learning technique that helps information retention. And the idea behind a mnemonic is we translate information into a form that our brains are more likely to retain. Okay? You can see the slide here gives you two really good examples. If you ever wanted to remember the 5 Great Lakes, you can use the mnemonic called HOMES for Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Okay? That's a technique. That's a learning technique that we use when we encode memory. If I asked you to remember the 5 lakes and didn't give you any kind of a tool, you'd probably forget one. Okay? The other example that we use a lot is the mnemonic for remembering not only the planets, but the order of the planets. And so you can remember a phrase like, my very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas. And those initials, first letters of each of those words represent the 5 planets, the 9 planets in the order that they are from the sun. So this is an example of a mnemonic. Imagery is another example of how you can encode information to help you remember it. It's very powerful. You create a mental picture. We talk about perhaps politicians doing this all the time, where they're introduced to 40, 30, 40, 100 people in an auditorium, in a banquet, in a dinner, in a fundraiser. And they have this ability to remember all of those names, and they do it by creating mental pictures of people that they've just been introduced to. And it's a powerful aid for providing, especially when it's combined with semantics. In other words, if I were to ask you to remember in chapter 7 where you saw the picture on computers, you might be able to do that because you have taken a mental picture of page number, and I'm looking it up in the book, page number 215. And you remember that the picture of the computer, just remind you where that was, the picture of a computer was on page 215. So it's a way for you to remember things. Another example is chunking. The best example that I can use of chunking is the way that you remember phone numbers. Phone numbers, when I was young, were only 7 characters, 7 numbers. Now you have to add the area code to them, but we still remember the numbers by chunking them together. 412-788-4876. The brain is much more likely to remember 3 groups than it is 10 individual numbers. So think about that when you're doing your own learning. Try to organize things so that it occurs to you more automatically. All right, let's talk storage for a second. I wanted you to remember the model of information, and the first thing that it showed you was how we take information and put it into short-term memory. Short-term memory is very limited in both duration and capacity. Most research shows us that we can remember things in short-term memory for only about 20 to 30 seconds. That's the duration part. And normally we only remember 5 to 7 individual things. That's why, again, in short-term memory, unless we do something with it very quickly, we're going to lose it. So that little figure there kind of shows you that if you try to recall 100 items, you're not going to be able to do that. You can do about 7 items, and 7 items you can remember. But the decline, as you can see, between the number of items that you can remember and the amount of time is very rapid. So we got to do something quickly, and that what we do is we put it into long-term memory. So most of us we might not be able to remember that what I just said a few minutes ago, which was the computer images, was on page 215. But you can remember who your first grade teacher was that you had 15, 18 years ago, right? And the reason you can do that is because in long-term memory, we have both explicit memory and implicit memory. We have both declarative memory and what we call procedural memory. Let's take the declarative memory first. Basically, declarative memory is a series of facts and experiences. Okay? They happen to you very explicitly. I apologize, there's a little bit of banging going on. There's some construction work being done outside, so we'll try not to let that interfere with our ability to go through this program here. But with explicit memory, you're remembering where you were last summer. You're remembering the beach that you were at. You're remembering the ride that you took on Kennywood when you went to visit the park. You remember specific experiences. That's what helps you remember long-term memory. Okay? Procedural memory is a recollection of processes. Okay? You remember how to use a typewriter. You remember how to walk to your grandmother's house. Those are procedural memories. Both of those are part of long-term, and both of those help us store information in long-term memory. All right, once it's in there now I'm a lot older than you guys, so I have a lot more things in my long-term memory. But even though they might be in my long-term memory, I still have to be able to recall them or recognize them for them to be effective. And so recall is one way of retrieving information. It's something that I learned earlier. I'm going to fill in the blank kind of a test. I learned this word before, and I need to recall it so that I can use it in a particular situation. Okay? I might remember my favorite song when I went to my high school prom. That's a recall measure. It's something that happened for me 35, 40 years ago, but I can still recall that information. Okay? The other type of retrieval is when something triggers my memory. Recognition. So all I have to do there is to identify something that I previously learned. So if I give you a multiple choice test and I ask you a question and I give you 4 answers, your long-term memory comes into effect when it tries to recall those 4 terms, A, B, C, and D, and link it to the stem of the question. Okay, so it's a very effective way for us, and that's how you retrieve information. So you got to remember when you put it into long-term memory that you're going to put an anchor on every piece of information, so that you can either recall it, or if you see it again, you can recognize it. That's why some people, for example, will use 3x5 cards to write down their notes before they take a test. They're using recognition. That's what they're trying to do. If you go into the book and highlight your textbook, you're trying to use the recall piece. You're trying to be able to retrieve information that you learned earlier. Okay? Here's an example of the process again with external events, sensory memory, how it goes into, as we saw, short-term memory, and how it goes into long-term memory. And then this is kind of interesting because this is now the term forgetting. And what happens when you forget is that link is broken between long-term memory and back into short-term memory. That's what the definition of forgetting is. Okay? You can't retrieve information from long-term memory. It's probably still in there, but your ability to recall or recognize has been broken. Okay? Either because it's been too long, or maybe it wasn't that important, or as the book mentions, there are simply too many things for people to remember. When I have my little fits of forgetting, I tell people it's not that I forgot you, it's just that I've got so many other things in my head right now that I've broken the link. I can no longer recall or recognize where I learned this particular information from. Okay, chapter 7 for me is one of the most important chapters in the book, because as a psychologist, and for me as an educational psychologist, I want to understand how people learn. Now, I teach another course in the School of Education and Social Sciences here at Robert Morris that is entitled The Psychology of Learning. So we spend an entire semester on what you just learned in chapters 6 and 7, and most specifically chapter 7. So don't get overwhelmed by the amount of information that you found in those 2 chapters. When we get together with our synchronous discussion, we'll take time, we'll go back over some of these concepts, we'll talk a little bit about the applications and how they work, and we'll get a chance to talk more about memory, encoding, storage, and retrieval. Okay, so we'll see you at an upcoming synchronous session, and look forward to our discussion on memory and learning.